would we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening?
Hi everybody, this is John here. This is Paul, George,
and Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your programme once again.
I am very happy to welcome Philip Norman, the author of Shout, the first serious biography of the Beatles, and books on John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, among many others. He has just published a book called Mr. Moonlight. It's a biography of Brian Epstein. Welcome, Mr. Norman.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
What was your motivation for writing Mr. Moonlight?
I had written about Brian Epstein, of course, in the books that I'd written about the Beatles collectively, Shout, then the individual biographies of Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison. But I realized in writing those other books how much I really still had to write about Brian Epstein. Firstly, the scale of his amazing achievement, absolutely amazing achievement, without any experience of pop management. I mean, to have really taken the Beatles to that extraordinary level and kept them there, and by his just instinct, with a lot of good luck, just had a career like no other pop manager before or since. But also the problems that he was always having to face. Firstly, homophobia. This was a time of dreadful sexual intolerance, and also anti-Semitism. We think that is peculiar to our times now, but it's not. It was very bad. And Brian never really got away from it in his, unfortunately, very short life, because he died aged only 32.
What was the single most important new information in the book?
Well, I go right back to Brian's childhood, and the only really sort of happy gay relationship he ever had was when he was really only in his teens. So I think that there is a revelation all along the way, really. But it's actually the scale of his achievement. When he started out, as you probably know, he was laughed at for saying that these young lads that he'd found in this Liverpool cellar would be bigger than Elvis Presley. After 2 years in his hands, they were bigger than 20 Elvis Presleys. They were bigger than any earthly measurement could register. And the way that he protected them, the way that he looked after them, because Brian really, he wasn't going to marry because he was gay. He wouldn't be allowed to adopt children because he was gay. So he treated the Beatles not like his clients, but as his children. He protected them as if they were just his kids and adored them. He was on two levels, really, with the Beatles. He treated them as his children and created this protective screen around them, so that, you know, the fame that they had was appalling. It was terrifying, could have torn them to pieces, not only mentally, but physically. But also he was utterly in love with John Lennon. He was infatuated with John. He never really showed it except once on very ill-advised occasion. But it was always there. It was like scar tissue that could always bleed afresh without warning. So there seemed, to me, there was so much more to say.
Did his sexuality and the social attitudes of the 60s prevent him from receiving more of the recognition he should have gotten?
It was both in the sense of anti-Semitism and in homophobia. It was a peculiarly British kind of prejudice that only the victim knows about. It's a kind of stealthy prejudice, the British kind, no less insidious than raw, overt prejudice. He was always aware of it. I mean, for instance, when the Beatles were playing the Royal Variety performance, the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was present. He wasn't allowed, he wasn't in the receiving line to shake hands with the Queen Mother. I mean, little things like that all the time. Or even when he was at the height of his fame, he thought perhaps that when he branched out into lots of other areas apart from running pop bands and pop artists. At one point he had a theatre called the Savile Theatre. He knew from experience, he always loved the theatre himself, that the theatre was more sort of tolerant than other parts, you know, other realms of the arts. And yet he was having lunch with his associate, Geoffrey Ellis, in this restaurant, the Mirabelle. And this very well-known actor walked out and walked past Brian's table and was heard to say loudly, "I didn't know they let queers in here now." He never got away with horrible moments like that.
You mentioned the fact that Brian had an attraction for John. Can you go into that a little deeper and also talk about how John felt about him?
Well, John, to begin with, like all of the others, was very impressed because Brian was obviously wealthy. The Beatles had had other kind of managers who were sort of, a bit of a sort of mixed bag of, very much in it for themselves. Brian already had money; he didn't need money. With Brian, it was something else. It was a sort of fascination with these very very good looking young lads, which was he was going to keep really on that level. Except that John did fascinate him, and at one stage he did very ill-advisedly. Just after John's first son, Julian, had been born, instead of John going bonding with his new son and comforting his very overwrought young wife, went to Spain on holiday, just the two of them with Brian. And that was very, very risky thing to do. Luckily, it never got into the papers. That would have been the end of Brian. It would be the end of the Beatles, probably. But John, being John, very, very mischievous, could be very cruel, would sometimes play on Brian's fascination with him, Brian's love of him, Brian's adoration of him. So there were moments when a friend, someone I knew very well who was close to Brian, said that Brian would sit in his car afterwards crying, literally crying, over the things John had said to him.
The Spanish holiday has been discussed a lot, and whether, anything happened. As far as you can tell, did anything happen there?
Well, later on, when John was with Yoko Ono, later on, who was a completely unshockable woman, that was one of the reasons that John wanted to be with her. She just didn't give a damn about anything or anybody, And John had had to be this sort of conform to this lovable mop top image for so long. And so Yoko was really a sort of liberation for him. He did eventually say to Yoko that he'd had a sexual encounter with Brian. He tried it twice, the first time to see what it was like, and the second time to make sure he didn't like it.
You say that Brian Epstein ordered 10,000 copies of Love Me Do for NEMS, and this has been disputed by some writers, including Mark Lewison. What did you base that on?
Well, Brian, first of all, had an absolutely free hand in running his family's record department in the family store, NEMS, which there were two or three eventually. And so his instinct for ordering records that other stores in Liverpool were not ordering was he had a very good track record on that. This man, Joe Flannery, who had been his lover when they were both very young, who was always close to Brian after that, said that Brian had taken him into a storeroom and shown him all these unopened cartons of records, and even sung a little song about them. Which said, "Here we go gathering dust in May." It was like, "Here we go gathering nuts in May." But what he didn't realize was that wasn't really any use in getting the Beatles into the top 10, or certainly not just about into the top 20, maybe, because that's not how the charts were calculated in Britain at the time. But Brian had always been willing to spend endless amounts of money before this incident, before they actually got onto record. Brian was willing to shell out money to anybody who could get them into the charts.
So he, according to that logic, he did order the 10,000 copies then.
There is
correct?
nothing to say that he didn't. And his father, it wasn't like chart fixing. It was attempted chart fixing. But Brian had complete discretion in that sort of thing. The argument is that his father, who was the boss of the company, would never indulge in anything like chart fixing. But that's just Brian was left to get on with it. And because his track record in ordering hit records was very, very good.
He really expanded his empire from the Beatles, taking in all the other groups that like Jerry and the Pacemakers and Cilla Black. And he also, you mentioned he bought the theater. Were there other things he did that are lesser known?
Well, his real ambition, first of all, was to be originally an actor. He'd been a rather good actor. He went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and had very good reports from there. But he really became an impresario. He became a mogul. There was a time before the Beatles were really famous when he was putting them on Merseyside in these gigantic, spectacular concerts. He was an impresario, and he took the only person who came near his sort of devotion to the Beatles was Cilla Black. And Brian, at another point in his life, had wanted to be a couturier. So he took a tremendous interest in Cilla's hairdos and her gowns and that sort of thing. You know, he had many, many talents, which all came together somehow in this unique sort of management figure who had so much more than just management to offer.
Talk about how his relationship with the Beatles evolved from beginning to end.
Well, to begin with, they were very impressed by him because he had money. He didn't need money. He had a nice car. And what he did really, which was so clever, was that he cleaned them up. He made them kind of acceptable. Rock and roll still had the sort of blue collar sort of element about it after the 1950s and the smashing up the cinemas that happened in Britain with Bill Haley and the Comets and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And he, as one fan at the Cavern Club, they suddenly looked as if they'd been steam cleaned after Brian had got them suits, not just tatty group, beat group suits, but really nice, tailored, bespoke suits. But he did not interfere with their music and he did not interfere with their personalities. And he gave them his refinement. He passed along to them, and they always had this air of being refined, of just being socially acceptable, which was so important because it simply broke down the barriers that had been around rock and roll music. So eventually, middle class teenagers could like the Beatles and could like pop music. And so could the aristocracy and even the royal family in the end were captivated by this. It's extraordinary, social and cultural achievement.
And it continues on through today, and that's even more amazing. You suggest that Brian might have been killed by the mob in the book. Do you actually believe that, or I'm not? I mean, is it some? Did you just write it down as like a journalist, or is that your actual view?
I don't write anything I don't believe. And
Okay.
also, one can never really know for sure. There were certain very, very strange aspects of his death. And he had brushed against the world of organized crime, particularly after the Beatles were working in the studio and didn't need his care so much. They fell into the orbit of the two biggest crime bosses in London, who were called the Cray twins. And one of the Cray twins, they themselves had thought of trying to take over the Beatles, which would, of course, been the end of the Beatles as well. But one of the Cray twins commented, because the Crays were the mob's representatives in Britain, and after Brian's death, it was Reggie Cray who was marginally the less sort of savage and predatory of the two of these twins, said it to a very, very reputable journalist I knew in Liverpool, it wasn't us, which meant it had been somebody. And that was a very powerful clue, which in the end, of course, unfortunately led nowhere. But there was another person who had worked on the Beatles merchandising operation in America from their first conquest of America, and this enormous merchandising opportunity had been fouled up really by Brian. And in fact, one of the people who lost a lot of money in that terrible episode of what is called the Cell Tab company, which Beatles was absolutely sure that he knew that in public, someone who lost a lot of money had had a heart attack and died. And his son had publicly threatened to take out a contract on Brian.
How did Brian's death change the Beatles? And do you think they would have stayed together longer had he lived?
They would have stayed together, and I'm not in the way they had been together when they were closest together. But it absolutely, as John said, on being told the news of Brian's death, then we're fucked. And they were. And, no one was going to look after them the way Brian had protect them. They realized they appreciated him much too late, this, invisible shield he'd put around them. So there were 2 years of drift while they tried to look for another manager. Of course, there could never be another manager like Brian. The 2 years of drift led to Alan Klein, a massive crook and con man. And that was the end. Not the end of the Beatles, but the end of the Beatles as a live, an artistic entity.
Did writing Mr. Moonlight change your opinion of any of the Beatles?
Well, I have changed my opinion of them over the years in any case. I mean, I was not very fair to Paul McCartney in my original Beatles book, Shout. I didn't think someone could just manage to be that nice and that civilized. And I always thought it was a bit of an act. And a lot of other people thought that as well, but it wasn't actually. You know, even as the most adored human being on the surface of the planet, he still has these good values that his widowed father, after the death of his mother, instilled in him. George, I always thought a bit of a misery, and I did write an unfortunately negative obituary of George. But I found out the reason for that because George was always the one who was marginalized and shut out of this amazing, songwriting dynamo was Lennon and McCartney. And by sheer force of will and wanting, he did become he did end up writing songs, not as many great ones as Lennon and McCartney, but the best of George's are up there with the best of theirs.
That's really true. After reading the book, what do you hope that readers say about Brian Epstein that they wouldn't say, that weren't saying before?
Well, although Brian's legacy is there, this gigantic legacy, which it didn't only affect popular music, it affected Britain's status in the world. Britain in the 1950s had been sort of written off, after the Suez Crisis, various diplomatic humiliations. Suddenly, Britain was where every young person in the world wanted to be. That was really because of the Beatles. And yet he certainly never got any public honor, never even got any thanks for doing that. And in a way, he's still overlooked. A couple of days ago, it was Global Beatles Day, which is sort of basically focused around the One World satellite broadcast they made in 1967. That was
Hmm.
totally Brian. Brian persuaded them to do it. They thought they had decided to do no more live shows and that this was going to be a live show. He also persuaded them not to just have a track from Sergeant Pepper, their latest album, but Lennon and McCartney to write a song specially for this broadcast, which was All You Need Is Love. And yet again, in all of the publicity around Global's Beatles Day, Brian's name was not mentioned once.
Was Brian the best manager the Beatles could have had?
Well, there was no one else like him. He had other sort of managers, sometimes two at once. And they they had a lot of bad luck, the Beatles, but this was their great stroke of good luck. And nobody else could have been like him. Nobody else ever has been like him.
What do you think about the four biopics that Sam Mendes is heading that I guess won't be out for another couple of years?
Yes, I have a feeling that his writers and his creative teams are reading my books with great attention.
Hmm. Are you planning on doing an updated version of Shout at some point?
Yes, there's going to be Shout is going to be reissued actually at the same time that the Mendes films are. They're all coming out together. So yes, I'm going to have to I've done lots of updating, but this is like a new edition altogether of Shout.
Okay. Will that be your next Beatle book, or are you going to do another one
There's
before that and maybe on Ringo?
no. I don't think really there is a book there. Only a booklet.
I mean, when you think about the way he started, he was very ill, and then he went through Beatlemania like everybody else did. And then after the Beatles broke up, he went through basically substance abuse, and now he's so healthy now. I just saw him about a week or so ago. I think that's amazing, but you don't think that's worth a book?
That's only one sort of strand of a life. I'm very delighted that he's okay and got over substance abuse, but I couldn't write a 100,000 word biography based on saying that.
Everybody compares your work with Mark Lewison because you two guys are the most prominent Beatle authors. How would you compare your work with his, and how do you feel about him?
I have no real feeling about him. I actually discovered him. He did some research for me on Shout, so
Mhm.
I created a monster.
Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
My
Best of
pleasure.
luck, best luck to you with Mr. Moonlight, and hope we get to talk again.
I hope so, and thanks for your time. Thank you. Bye bye.
We saw two concerts recently, Ringo Starr and Peter Asher, that we thought we should tell you about. We saw Ringo near the end of his spring tour in San Jose, California. While the set list didn't have any surprises in it, what was nice to see was how well the band was interacting with each other and the audience. We have to say that at the show we saw, the band was very tight and the audience was really enjoying themselves. Ringo was in a great mood, often tossing comments to the audience. The band sounded a lot tighter than they had to us in the past. Even if it's most of the same songs, the band wasn't just coasting, they were putting a lot of effort behind their playing. Of course, the show ended with a little help from my friends and Give Peace a Chance, in which Ringo did his customary jumping jacks on stage. For a guy who was just about to turn 86 the night we saw that show, he does a lot, and he definitely gets around. Ringo just announced a summer tour on the East Coast, and we really recommend a show if it comes near you. We also saw Peter Asher during this time period, and we saw him in a small venue show in Danville, California. The place was pretty full, and the show, in which Asher and his band, which consisted of two other musicians, really filled the hall with some great music. The show is bookended at the beginning and the end with World Without Love in two different versions. At the beginning, you'll hear the original Paul McCartney demo, which brought a lot of oohs and ahs from the audience who apparently hadn't heard that before. At the end was Asher leading the audience in a sing-along of Peter and Gordon's first #1 hit, World Without Love. And the audience really got into that. Another great part of the show is the electronic reunion with Peter's original singing partner, Gordon Waller, on the Peter and Gordon hit, Woman, that was also written by Paul McCartney. It's a very emotional experience. Asher is also the star of a recently released documentary called Peter Asher Everywhere Man, which has started showing in selected theaters around the country. Though an independent production, the film covers much of the same ground as Asher's show. In other words, it concentrates more on his older work than his newer work, and it's a great experience. But so is the live show. Asher, who has been famous as both a singer and a musician and a renowned record producer, is a great showman in these little shows. We're also happy to recommend the movie Peter Asher Everywhere Man, which has some great archival material along with the story of his musical career.
Be seeing you.